there's a specific feeling that comes from trying too hard. You know the one, the conversation you were trying to steer that got harder to steer the more you tried. The negotiation that stiffened the moment you started pushing. The relationship that pulled away the more you reached for it. The sleep that wouldn't come precisely because you couldn't stop chasing it. The idea that wouldn't arrive until you finally stopped trying to summon it, and then arrived the moment you turned your attention elsewhere. Everyone has felt this. Almost nobody names it correctly. It gets called bad luck or bad timing or a hard week. What it actually is, though, is one of the oldest observations in human wisdom, and one that a small group of thinkers in a completely different part of the world from Baltasar Gracián had already articulated with tremendous precision, roughly 2,000 years before Gracián was born. The idea is called Wu Wei. It comes from an ancient Chinese text called the Tao Te Ching, sometimes rendered Tao Te Ching, attributed to a figure named Lao Tzu, possibly a real man, possibly a composite of several teachers, writing sometime around the 6th century BCE. The text is short, 81 brief chapters totaling roughly 5,000 Chinese characters, and it is one of the most translated works in human history. Wu Wei is one of its central concepts, and one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of philosophy, because it does not translate cleanly into English. The literal meaning is something like non-doing or non-forcing, and if you leave the definition there, you will misunderstand it entirely. Because Lao Tzu was not telling anyone to do nothing. He was pointing at something much more precise and much more useful. Here is one of the passages that comes closest to what he meant. Chapter 43 of the Tao Te Ching. The softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. That which has no substance enters where there is no space. This is how I know the value of non-forcing. Sit with that for a moment. He is not saying softness is a strategy. He is not saying you should be soft in order to win. He is pointing at a fact about how the world actually works. Water shapes stone. Not by being harder than stone, but by being patient enough and shaped rightly enough to eventually get through. Wind moves mountains, not by pushing them, but by weathering them, particle by particle, over enough time. The softest things overcome the hardest things, because forcing is not the only way pressure travels. Wu Wei is the human version of that observation. It is the recognition that action which fits a moment perfectly does not need to force anything. It moves with the situation instead of against it. It waits for the opening, rather than trying to break the door. It uses the momentum that already exists, rather than trying to generate its own from nothing. This is not passivity. This is a very specific kind of activity, one that most people are not trained to see, because our whole culture teaches us that effort equals push, and that the harder you push, the more you achieve. Lao Tzu is telling us that the harder you push against a situation that does not want to move, the more you exhaust yourself, and the less the situation moves. And the person who has trained themselves to notice when to push and when to yield, that person accomplishes more with less effort than anyone straining against the world for a lifetime. Three places this shows up. The first is probably happening in your life this week. Disagreements. You have almost certainly been in an argument where you were technically right, made your case well, and lost the person anyway, not because your logic failed, but because the harder you argued, the more the other person hardened. This is one of the most reliable patterns in human conversation. It is exactly what Wu Wei is pointing at. The person who yields a little, who acknowledges what is true in the other person's position before insisting on their own, almost always ends up moving the conversation further than the person who stands firm and pushes. The push creates the resistance. Softening the push removes the resistance. This isn't manipulation. It is the physics of persuasion, and Lao Tzu described it 2,500 years ago. Second, ambition. Every person who has tried to force a career, a relationship, a life to look a certain way by a certain time knows the feeling. The harder you grip the outcome you want, the further it seems to slip. Lao Tzu's observation is that this is not accidental. Gripping tightly signals to the world and to yourself that you do not trust the process you are inside of, and that signal changes what the world offers back to you. The person who moves toward what they want without strangling it, who takes the next reasonable step without demanding a specific arrival time, that person usually gets further and gets there more sustainably than the one white-knuckling every mile of the road. Third, creativity and insight generally. This is the one every person who has ever had a good idea knows in their bones. You cannot force an insight. You can prepare for one. Reading, thinking, wrestling with a problem. But the moment of arrival almost never happens while you are trying. It happens in the shower, on a walk, falling asleep. The moment you stop forcing, the mind is allowed to do what it does when it is not being crowded. This is not laziness disguised as wisdom. It is a fact about how the mind actually generates its best material. Lao Tzu understood this, and every good creative process, every skilled negotiator, every experienced parent, every artist worth listening to, has some intuition of it, even if they have never heard the phrase Wu Wei. Now something worth pausing on. Baltasar Gracián, writing in 17th century Spain, in a Jesuit tradition, for readers navigating the courts of Catholic Europe, arrived at a strikingly similar observation. He called it subtle strength, the quiet, disciplined power of the person who governs their own impulses before the world governs them for them. Where Lao Tzu spoke of yielding, Gracián spoke of restraint. Where Lao Tzu wrote of water-shaping stone, Gracián wrote in Aphorism 3 that things should be done but not made too obvious in the doing. Different vocabularies, different centuries, different intellectual worlds, same core insight. The person who moves without forcing accomplishes more than the person who forces. Lao Tzu, or the tradition that speaks under his name, was writing in ancient China, roughly 2,200 years before Gracián. They never read each other. They almost certainly never heard of each other. And yet, they arrived at the same observation independently. When two entirely separate traditions, working with entirely different vocabularies, arrive at the same insight independently, that is worth paying attention to. It suggests they are not describing a cultural preference or a philosophical style. They are describing something closer to a fact about how the world works. And if two of the sharpest observers of human life, working 2,000 years apart, both pointed at this thing, then it is probably worth taking seriously. Something small to try, in keeping with the idea itself. Sometime in the next day, you will find yourself pushing on something that is not yielding, a conversation, a task, a person, a plan. You will feel that specific stiffening, yours or theirs, that tells you the push is no longer working. When you notice it, before you push harder, try this. Stop pushing for 1 full minute. Not forever, not as a strategy, just as an experiment. Yield the pressure for 60 seconds and see what happens. You are not giving up. You are not conceding. You are simply removing the pressure long enough to see what the situation does on its own. Sometimes it moves. Sometimes it doesn't. But you will start to see the difference between situations that were waiting for your force and situations that were waiting for you to stop applying it. Good night, and notice in the next day or two where you are pushing on a door that might have been ready to open on its own.